In this lecture video, we'll be looking at Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Hobbes was an English philosopher who really helped move away from much of the ancient paradigm concerning virtue in politics and political philosophy, and especially the medieval paradigm of the notion of the divine right of kings. His seminal work is Leviathan, published in 1651. This is notable because the English Civil War lasted from 1642 to 1651, and it was very much the breakdown of civil order and the turn to civil war that led to Hobbes being influenced to write Leviathan. And I think we'll see why that is. First, we should understand the idea of the divine right of kings. So the divine right of kings said that basically God has ordained rulers and therefore given them legitimacy to rule over subjects. Now, if you are, religious, hopefully of that religion which the crown is as well and which endorses, then maybe that works for you and you will obey that ruler. But maybe that ruler has a different belief than you, or maybe you're not religious at all. Can there be any non-religious reason given as to why one ought to obey the sovereign? This is the challenge that Hobbes undertakes, to give an argument as to why we ought to obey a sovereign, and overturning then the medieval idea of the divine right of kings. So Hobbes starts with, very much the psychology of individuals. So he gives kind of an argument about what we would call moral psychology, as well as, I think, social psychology. And basically he says that all human beings naturally have certain desires that we don't just want to attain and achieve once or fulfill once, but perpetually. It's this natural drive. So we have certain desires, whatever they may be, sex, power, food, whatever kind of pleasure those desires may be. They can be material or non-material. The ultimate object desired, though, Hobbes argues, is the assuring of a contented life. It is basically peace, because Hobbes is going to say, well, basically it's only peace that enables us to attain all those other, or at least pursue all those other desires. Now the key question is, how is peace attained? And Hobbes argues peace is attained through power. It's through power because you prevent others from interfering with your ability to pursue that which you desire. So that is the prerequisite to pursuing the ultimate object desired, the assuring of a contented life. Now the problem is, this desire, which leads to power, only ever ends with death. So there is no possibility that we can achieve these prerequisites and then we don't have to keep resorting to the use of power to ensure that we can pursue that which we desire. It is a struggle that is part of the human condition. Human beings in this way are hardwired, Hobbes thinks, for pursuing what we desire and ultimately trying to do whatever we can to get it. And if that means pursuing power to subdue others to prevent them from getting in our own way, then we will do that. And ultimately we will not stop until we are dead. I think this is often the case when people talk about having children and, just openly saying, I would do anything for them, right? I'd kill for my own kids or things like that. It seems to be a very natural sentiment that Hobbes is trying to reveal and demonstrate its role in politics. So this leads Hobbes to say that it is the obeyance of a single power, a very strong power, as opposed to the competition of multiple, which makes possible the desire of knowledge, arts, peace, and the desire of leisure. All the things basically that make society. So he's saying it's not competition which makes possible society, but the obeyance of a single power. And we'll see why that is. So Hobbes thinks that humans are naturally selfish. We're naturally selfish, even though we're born of relatively equal mental and physical ability. That, yes, some people are born a little stronger, some weaker, some taller, some shorter, and so on, right? But by and large, the ability to use reason is relatively the same. And, it's not like one person has the strength of, 3 people. Really, if one person can do something, typically, at least 2 people can do that same thing in terms of, physical ability. So there's nothing that is like a serious inequality physically, Hobbes thinks, among people. Now, of course, there's, people who work out and so on, right, and who go on to be bodybuilders. But there's nothing principally that stops, in general, other humans from doing the same. So Hobbes says that in the state of nature, then, in the nature of man, we find 3 principal causes of quarrel. So 3 principal things that lead to conflict among human beings in the nature of man. And so here, this idea of the state of nature, right, this is if the government didn't exist, either historically prior to, logically prior to, or just naturally, always this is who we are. So the 3 principal causes of quarrel are, first, he says, competition. And he says competition is produced by men pursuing the same objects, which maketh men invade for gain. That there are limited resources in the world, maybe, some women or men that we want, and more than one of us like the same woman or man. We want glory, or we want other kinds of food, money, whatever else it may be, right? These are limited in nature. So we're already having many pitted against each other pursuing the same thing, which is less than the number of people there are. Now, competition produces diffidence. He says that men do not take pleasure in each other's company if there is no power over them all, because they're always going to be suspicious that someone else is going to try and take what I want or what I have. And if there's no one person to kind of keep everyone in check, then we are going to be in a state of diffidence towards each other, where we're not going to quite be settled and content. This makes people pursue safety through fear of potential superiority of others. This is why safety, security, is so important and really is the foundation of politics for Hobbes. Now, diffidence ultimately leads to glory, because it is through the use of violence to establish oneself as that superior power that ends the state of diffidence. It is only by submitting to someone else who is powerful, who can keep others in check, that thereby ends the diffidence, because we know, hey, I don't have to worry about those people over there, because if they cross the line, big guy is going to take care of them. Or it's through myself, attempting to be the most powerful, subduing everyone else, that once I do that, then I know I'm on top. I don't have to worry about everyone else. I'm the one they submit to. So it is only through the pursuit of glory, then, that we can end diffidence. It is only through, not just, it doesn't mean actually physically subduing everyone, right? But let's say you subdued enough people that now people start to hear about you. And now they start to respect you because they hear, hey, you don't want to mess with him. So the pursuit of these objects and the ultimate, sense in which we want to avoid diffidence, how it's unsettling, Hobbes thinks this reveals what he calls liberty. Now we know it to be by negative liberty, because there are different conceptions of liberty. He says, by liberty is understood as the absence of external impediments, that a human being is free to the extent that they are not being coerced by others. Now, this is often actually in political philosophy known as preference satisfaction, that we are free when we're able to satisfy our preferences, whatever it is our desire is. He also says then that what is revealed through understanding kind of this moral psychology and the social psychology of individuals that leads to competition, diffidence, and glory is natural right. And he says, the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature is his natural right. So basically, natural right is the ability to seek self-preservation. Now, we want to ask, of course, right? Liberty is the freedom from external impediments, right? Liberty is to be free is to not have anyone coercing you, right? Stopping you from pursuing what you want. One basic question would be that if everyone is free to do as they please, do they really have liberty? Could it be the case that if everyone is able to pursue whatever it is they want, is everyone then free? And we're going to quickly see no, because if everybody is free to pursue whatever they want, then once again we're going to get back to competition. Competition is going to produce diffidence, which is going to produce glory. So freedom, let's say like pure freedom, Hobbes thinks leads actually to a sacrifice of freedom, to the subduing of freedom generally. Before we get to that, we need to focus a little bit more on his idea of the state of nature. So Hobbes says that the state of man in nature is a state of war of everyone against everyone. It is a state of constant conflict. And it's not just a state of constant physical conflict, but also psychological conflict. He says, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. So what he's saying is, the state of nature isn't just a state of constant conflict, that you're always being attacked by others. But it's also psychological. It's constantly being on edge, worried that someone else might attack you. So you can never be at peace, not just physically, but also mentally. There is no freedom to think about things beyond our immediate circumstances. And so he says, the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. So all other time that is not in actual fighting, and that is not in the disposition thereto of fighting, is peace. So this leads Hobbes to characterize the state of nature as being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Very famous 5 words in political philosophy. Human beings are selfish, according to Hobbes. They are immoral. That is the nature. And without government, this is the state in which natural human beings exist. Life in these circumstances is terrible because there is no ability to pursue any great buildings. There is no architecture. There is, of course, none of the higher disciplines. No study of mathematics. There is no study of philosophy. None of the arts. Any of that. Because there is no time to do so. There are no resources to do so. Because there is constant conflict, living a meager and short existence. There is also, Hobbes argues, no justice in the state of nature either. And this might seem weird, because we might want to say, well, there's an ideal of justice that we can say the state of nature falls short of. Because, you just have others killing each other and stealing and so on, right? So we would say there's injustice in the state of nature. But Hobbes says, well, no, because justice requires actually a certain kind of an agreement, right? Justice, he's going to argue, comes from the social contract, an agreement with others not to steal, not to kill. there is no agreement not to do these things in the state of nature. And if there is no agreement not to do these things, then there can be no acts of injustice. Now, that doesn't mean there's not acts of, maybe let's say, barbarism. There's not acts of violence, right? Violence is constant in the state of nature. But there is no injustice. So the only place there can be where there is justice is a government. When there is a government, when there is an agreement, a pact with others, that is the establishing of justice. So we must leave the state of nature because we can't pursue any of the things, the objects of our desires. Not just our immediate desires, but our ultimate or higher desires. Now, he does actually entertain an objection that's like, look, we can find other animals that are able to cooperate with each other for the common good. If other animals can do this, why can't humans do this? And the first premise in his argument as to why human beings cannot naturally cooperate and other creatures can is that humans are continually in competition for honor and dignity. Because again, this comes from our competition for desires, of which there are limited resources. The common good of these creatures, of animals, though, doesn't differ from their individual passions and interests. But human beings don't just desire natural things, let's just say like food and water and sex. Human beings also desire artificial things. Glory is something artificial. Honor, dignity, these are artificial concepts that have no sense in the animal kingdom. And that's just, not to include the desire for achievement, fulfillment. These kinds of things, which take on a whole life of, theory of what actually is this, what is the highest good, all these kinds of philosophical questions. Creatures and, other animals don't have these kinds of desires. Their desires are not distinct from their passions and interests. These animals also do not have the use of reason as humans do, and so they can't reflect on their situation and want something to be better, or reflect and think about how terrible it is, or why they hate, maybe someone else. That produces envy and conflict. These other creatures have no concept of morality to then judge other humans by. The other creatures don't judge each other according to these standards. Irrational creatures cannot distinguish between injury and damage, so something that is the fault of someone else and something that is maybe an accident or one's own fault. Human beings can distinguish between these things, and of course this leads us to lay blame to others and want to punish others, which again, in the state of nature, creates more conflict, more war of all against all. So ultimately, the reason why other creatures can cooperate and humans cannot is that the agreement of those creatures is natural, whereas that of humanity is artificial. So Hobbes says, these other creatures need no common power to keep them in awe and to direct their actions to the common benefit, because by instinct, they cooperate when they need to. Human beings don't have this kind of instinct. We require an artificial common power to keep us in check, for the sake of, when we use reason, to know what is in our own best interests. So we are able to leave the state of nature through what is known as social contract theory. And this is a justification for a government, right? When a government exists according to when it's based on the social contract, then we can say it is a legitimate form of government. And for Hobbes, the social contract is the natural right, is where the natural right of liberty can be transferred to a governing body by implied or tacit consent. So implied, either we don't explicitly acknowledge, or we implicitly maybe like we make a nonverbal agreement, or maybe through tacit, where we just don't offer any resistance. So basically, a state has legitimate authority over its subjects due to implied or tacit consent of the subjects living under the domain of the sovereign. Now, why not explicit? Why doesn't social contract theory say that a government can be legitimate if there's explicit consent. Well, there can be, right? Social contract theory would say, yeah, there can be explicit consent, except, well, most governments are so, have so many subjects, so many citizens, that it would be impossible for everyone to, explicitly consent to that government. And in fact, for Hobbes, it doesn't matter whether you have the opportunity to explicitly consent or not, because what makes a government legitimate is whether or not it saves you from the state of nature. Because existence under any kind of government is necessarily better than the state of nature. Hobbes says, if a covenant be made, wherein neither of the parties perform presently, but trust one another, in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, upon any reasonable suspicion, it is void. But if there be a common power set over them, both with right and force sufficient to compel performance, it is not void. So for Hobbes, you can't just enter a social contract through agreement of all, right? Let's say there's 10 people, and they want to agree to enter a government, and they all say, okay, we agree to abide by these 10 laws. Hobbes says that's not a sufficient form of agreement. That government won't be legitimate. Why? Well, how can you ensure that all the 9 other people are going to obey those laws? Ultimately, you can't. You will still be suspicious, trying to make sure everyone else is going to obey the laws just as you are, and everyone else is going to be doing the same of everyone else and of you. And that ultimately means you actually haven't left the state of nature, because you're still going to be living in this state of mental warfare, of suspicion. That is why you can't simply just have a contract that everyone signs and then you have a legitimate form of government. You haven't left the state of nature. You only leave the state of nature if there is a common power, a sovereign, set over everyone else to force everyone to compel. To say, if you violate these laws, you will be sanctioned. Because it's only when you have that you can have peace of mind with everyone else. Because everyone else then won't have to worry, hey, is that other person going to follow the law or not? Because they know if they don't follow the law, the sovereign will punish them. And besides the fact that they know there will be consequences, that also then is a form of deterrence. So then they can also have peace of mind to know, hey, most likely this person is going to be reasonable and not want to be punished, so they're going to follow the law. So Hobbes argues there's 2 ways a commonwealth may be formed: through natural force or by mutual agreement to submit to one power. So a legitimate form of government for Hobbes would be where someone conquers what are now their subjects. That would be a legitimate form of government, taking power by force. Why would it be a legitimate form of government? Because those people living under that monarch or sovereign would be living a better life than they would be in the state of nature. You can also mutually agree, you can consent to submit to the power of someone else. That is fine as well. Because then you're still agreeing to submit to the final decision by that person who's going to punish anyone who violates the laws. You just simply cannot agree to enter a voluntary pact with other people without there being a sovereign whom everyone has to submit to. We also have to wonder, well, if it's legitimate that a government arise by natural force or mutual agreement to submit to one power, because it's not the state of nature, right? And so it's going to be better. Could there ever be a time when, someone, whoever that sovereign is or whatever body that sovereign is, makes it such that your life under that government is worse than it would be in the state of nature? Would you be justified in rebelling then? And Hobbes says yes. Basically, only if your existence under that government is worse than it could be in the state of nature, only then would you be justified in rebelling against that government. Now, of course, that's going to be extremely unlikely. It's going to be so difficult. Maybe only if you had some dystopian situation where literally everybody's being round up maybe in something actually like the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, that kind of a situation, would you be justified in rebelling against the government? But that's going to be something very rare. So typically, there is no right to rebel against the government, because no government is going to end up meeting the requirement that enables you to exercise that right. So Hobbes says the only way to erect such a common power is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. The sovereign then is effectively one will of all the individuals. Now, ironically, we could ask, okay, all the subjects that live in a government under the power of that one sovereign, they now live a peaceful life. They have security and order. But if effectively the sovereign is the plurality of voices into one will, well, if you have multiple states, wouldn't the existence among states be kind of a state of nature? Because each state is always going to be suspicious of the other one. Hobbes thinks this is just something inevitable. He doesn't think they're basically he thinks that the idea of like a one world government would be utopian. It's not feasible at all, because people differ far too much, and he doesn't think it would be possible to govern large numbers of people over the whole globe, let's say. So we are able to escape individually the state of nature, but nonetheless, that doesn't mean wars will end. There will inevitably be wars against other states. That aspect of kind of the psychology of human beings and their competition and diffidence that arises and glory is transferred from the individual level to the state level. So perhaps, that's maybe one problem with Hobbes' theory here, at least one problem maybe. But Hobbes would just say, look, I'm a realist. There will be no escaping war. It's an inevitable fact as long as there are states. But hey, it's better to have a state than not have a state, because at least if you have a state, you don't live in a war of all against all. So I want to leave you with this question. Do you agree with Hobbes' reasoning that human nature is naturally selfish and bad? Many people who think, this is why we need to have a government is because they can't trust everyone else, because they think, look, I'm ultimately going to do what's best for me. Other people, I think, are going to do the same, and this is why we need a government. So do you agree, then, that humans are naturally selfish and therefore immoral?